let me keep our focus on the question of development that works. The Center for Global Health and Development is a university-wide research center which is committed to doing policy and program relevant applied research that answers today's questions tomorrow, to deal with the marginalized populations of the world that face the challenges of health and development. And in that way, we are quite complementary to the Pardee Center's work of trying to take those questions and look not only in their application in real time, but what the implications of that will be over the longer range future. So through both the Center for Global Health and Development and the Pardee Center, and then our linkages to the educational programs that Kevin leads, we've really created, I think, an interesting community of development interested researchers, scientists, and I'll put it on my sleeve, and social activists. That the Center for Global Health and Development is a group of scientists who have chosen to locate themselves within a university, but are committed to the social change agenda, which I think is part of the development agenda, and do that unabashedly and frankly unashamedly. Which allows me to take the title of our conference and actually pose it not as a statement, development that works, but actually pose it in the way that I think it's meant, which is, what is it that works in development? And in fact, many industries, if you looked at them over the 50 years, and I'll just argue that development assistance highlight, as we heard from the first panel, from the 1960s, we have about a 50-year history. And we certainly have had successes. But we certainly have had failures also. And this question of what works in development and what we need to do for the next 50 years of this industry and this investment is, I think, the focus of this conference. Hold on to your seat tightly, because we're going to go from the 40,000 feet that the first panel operated at to maybe a helicopter, because drones are unpopular these days, but we're going to get much closer to the ground very quickly. Okay, and what we have, and why this panel is of particular interest to me as a social activist using health and development to improve population health around the world, is 3 examples of organizations or approaches to trying to figure out development that works. For 50 years, I would argue we've been dominated by state actors and by multilateral organizations. And in fact, as we heard, there are issues of governance, there are issues of policy, there are issues of voice and stakeholders. But what we have in this second panel is an opportunity for Doug Balfour, who runs an organization called Geneva Global, to talk about social philanthropy from an entrepreneurial point of view to motivate some of the new capital that's been created in the last 20 years of growth and wealth creation around the world, and sort of create a vehicle and a mechanism by which that social capital can be invested to possibly improve the health and development dynamics of persons. We also have what I would call an old foundation in a new environment. The Rockefeller Foundation has a remarkably rich history of its contributions to health and development. I know it because of its investment in creating schools of public health in the 1920s, is one of the best investments probably ever made by a foundation. But its role in agricultural change, it's got a huge and rich history as it approaches its birthday party of 100 years. And we have the privilege to have the person who's responsible for sort of evaluating not only the activities of the foundation, but evaluating the foundation itself as it begins to plan for the next 100 years. So I'm quite interested in hearing Nancy MacPherson's sort of conversation of how the Rockefeller Foundation evaluates its work so that it can find the investments in development that work in a very changed philanthropic environment, not only because times are changing, but because there's an elephant in the room called the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which drives a lot of agendas on health and development currently. Our last speaker is Iqbal Quadir, whom most of you probably know, because having a visionary who can take a piece of technology and say, this has uses aside from calling home to mom, and actually can be part of the development dynamic as a case study of the role of technology from the private sector and how it might contribute to the development dynamic is, I think, a third model of trying to sort of pose the question, what works in development, and take three different approaches that these three persons represent to give us some insight into their experiences. So with those introductory remarks, let me hand it over to Doug.
So I was having a conversation last night, and I was explaining that essentially my job is to help people give away money. And I got the question, well, isn't it easy to give away money? Why does anybody need any help? And it's a question often that wealthy people sort of pose to philanthropic intermediaries, consultants such as Geneva Global. And I think the answer is yes, it's really easy to give away money if you really don't care about how effective the outcome actually is. So we kind of focus a lot on trying to actually make the giving away of money in international development in the developing world really effective. We focus on all different sectors. This is just so you get some sort of sense of who I am and where I'm coming from. But essentially, we work in health, education, human liberty, economic empowerment, disaster recovery, environmental sustainability across the piece. And I've got a personal history of working with a major UK charity called Tier Fund, sixth largest aid agency in the UK, for about a decade, and then started to actually work with this very different private philanthropy vehicle, consultancy vehicle that has a large history, was set up by a couple of billionaires, and I have that in common with Iqbal in terms of Legatum actually is one of my biggest clients. And we've got into realizing that the people that we're really serving are ultra-high net worth organizations, ultra-high net worth individuals with their organizations, the corporates, corporate social responsibility, and private foundations. So we kind of like did that sort of 40,000 to a couple of hundred feet because our specialism is to actually work with small community-based organizations, clustering them together to actually get the most effective granting bang for your buck. But when you start looking at the sort of still keeping that big picture in mind, I mean, as I tried to think about, well, what ideally are we really looking for, then I'm still, the believer that says economic development coming from a vibrant business sector that includes the bottom billion within the country in question is actually the medium and long-term appropriate response to poverty. Do I believe that aid and granting actually helps? I think absolutely, because what do you do for the couple of decades while we're waiting for all this to actually happen in a sub-Saharan African country? And then obviously then you want cost-effective social services paid out of the taxes coming from that vibrant business community. And I would argue that there is then still a role for targeted private philanthropy aiming at the vulnerable and the marginalized, as we've actually seen in the West. So that's my big picture. When I talk about the people that I serve, my clients, the donors that we work with, then the question becomes, well, what are they really looking for? And I call it sizzle, because that, for me, best describes what their vision is, their vision of what they would actually like to contribute to in terms of social impact around the world. Actually, it tends to be a quite predictable pattern of words and ideas that we get communicated to us, and it doesn't really matter whether we're talking to an individual, a foundation, or a corporation. But basically, people are talking about wanting to actually have high impact. They're talking about having some element of scale and replication possibilities in the idea. They're looking at low cost. They're always using this word sustainable, although I think probably sustainable is the most misused word in international development. I honestly sometimes wonder what on earth we're actually talking about when we're talking about financial sustainability and granting. But to the level that that's possible, they're always talking about innovation and being innovative and creative and exciting. People are wanting often a direct connection, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking at the retail end of philanthropy with online giving sites, or whether we're actually talking about people that are putting $50 million into a very large program. People want to actually know what is actually happening, and they start to believe that that the old INGO, the old charity business proposition of trust us and we'll do a good thing is not going to cut it in the next couple of decades. And it doesn't matter whether you're working at the retail end or whether you're like us, you're working at the sort of major donor end. That is not going to be an acceptable answer to donors in the future. And then lastly, because of that, people are wanting transparent reporting, they're wanting metrics, they want to understand clear results. And as more of us start to provide that, then more donors are going to say, well, that's possible, therefore that's what I want. The standards of expectation are changing. One example of that in terms of Sizzle is we worked with a Norwegian organization in West Africa who are trying to get primary school kids back into school in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and basically managed, for 8 to 12-year-olds, managed to actually create a 10-month accelerated learning program where the kids came in their indigenous language, did literacy and numeracy. They then got into actually having to learn French, continued their studies in French for 10 months, learned life skills, and then had to pass a public exam to get back into school, the government schools. 80% of them succeeded, and the amazing thing was it cost about $140 per person plus $30 to work with self-help saving groups for the families, so that it meant that there was money potentially to keep the kids in schools. And that's a one-off cost. So $170 per child, per family, means that you transformed and given a second chance to a life of a child. Now that's what I call Sizzle, and that's why one of our clients actually funded it and saw 36,000 kids so far back into school. If I sort of talk about the issues a little bit wider, and I'm going to pick out just a number of these sort of principles for international granting of what I actually see as being starting to be best practice over 10 years of sort of doing something in the region of 1,800 projects. Then I'll start with, we talked about heresy earlier on. Another heretical idea in international development is that things can be donor influenced or even donor driven. That's akin to heresy. But I'd go further than that. I think we've got to allow our donors to actually have satisfaction, have fun, enjoy the fact that they're giving, enjoy the fact in private terms, in private philanthropy, that they're actually getting a fulfillment as a result of what they're doing. As we all know full well, if you're fulfilled and you enjoy what you're doing, you actually want to do more. So donor intent, being honest to donors, being honest about failures, as well as success in transparency is obviously really important. I've found that donors actually will accept the idea that a project fails. Typically, if they've got a portfolio of 3 or 4 projects, they don't want them all to fail. But actually, I've found that actually being honest about failure and underachievement in a portfolio where that's not always the case actually means that they start to trust you in terms of the rest of what you're actually telling them. Everybody instinctively knows that development doesn't always work, and is suspicious of the fact that what we tend to do as a sector is try and just put a high gloss on everything and sort of hide it behind closed doors when we actually talk about the sort of failures of our world. Good due diligence goes without really needing to say very much about that, other than the point that says we particularly like local community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, local grassroots charities, And I believe that they provide you potentially the best philanthropic bang for your buck in international development, but only if you are seriously connecting with them on a regular basis, doing site visits, not just taking the reports of what you're told and believing them, and really keeping people accountable and actually, choosing to actually focus on really good due diligence before. We talked about what works and what doesn't. When we analyzed back to 2003, 2004, all of our projects, we found out there were three categories of failure that cropped up time and again. I don't think this is going to sort of surprise anybody, but those three essentially were governance and leadership, getting the wrong, choosing to actually back the wrong horse, the wrong group of people. The second would be program design, particularly about the poor assumptions made and not enough research done in terms of assumptions that lie behind the project design. And then the third is the external factors and external circumstances that the project couldn't cope with, so not a good enough risk analysis or just overwhelming external circumstances. You only obviously know whether you're doing a good job if you've actually done the work on performance indicators. We use 4 complete different levels of performance indicators. There's a very interesting sort of conversation about social return on investment, whether it's really possible to do a calculator. We did 3 years worth of work and basically gave up the idea that it was possible to get a dollarized social impact and actually started to focus on an index of index type approach instead. The good and the great, that brings me to an example of a program that we're actually doing with John Simon and his center in terms of Boston University, where we're looking at orphan and abandoned children. We're looking at those orphans in sub-Saharan Africa. We're asking the question about, okay, so in the next 10 years or so, where are the creative models that are going to help us to look after orphans in the future, especially if, as we suspect, the extended family network is potentially going to struggle. So the good is obviously we can grant to those creative organizations, we can see the positive change in individuals, but what we've chosen to do is to get an analytical partner to actually work alongside us, do really systematic review in terms of baseline and before and after, do sort of 2 cohorts and do the whole academic study so that we can actually go out and disseminate the results and actually try and change people's policy, change where people put money, look at this whole issue and try and see if we can actually get the great as well with major policy change. So I'll just finish on sort of scale and sustainability in terms of this slide. It's the nirvana of international development as far as I can see in my 20-year history. Trying to actually get both is very, very difficult. Usually you can find one but not the other. What we've started to do is we've started to look at the possibility of getting small community-based organizations, clustering them together, something we call strategic initiatives, that give you some element of sustainability because you get community leadership, you get people that aren't going to move away from that area when the program finishes, but also you start to actually get scale, as long as it's all focused on one strategic issue. So, for instance, anti-human trafficking in North India, for instance, we got something in the region of 12 organizations all working together, bringing different pieces to that. Really interesting ideas, development that works. This is a little bit of our journey. One of the interesting things is, as an intermediary, you can only go as fast as your donors, but your donors actually can become, I mean, in my experience, quite sophisticated, quite fast, if you are willing to be open about the process. So I've just talked about the first thing which we've been experimenting with in the last 3 or 4 years, which is this strategic initiative approach. That's then taken us to the realization that it doesn't matter if you're Gates Foundation or anybody else, you always have aspiration as a donor to change more than you've actually got resources for, which is leading to another trend where a lot of donors are actually starting to come together and start to say, well, we'd actually like to see co-investment. We'd actually like to get together with other people as long as we're centering on things that we both jointly care about. Now, in private terms, nobody is going to do that unless they can actually slice and dice it so that they can actually focus their specific investment in an area that is important to them. So my example of this would be the End Fund. We've just launched a $100 million neglected tropical disease fund, the best philanthropic buy, I think, in global health, less than 50 cents per person per year, and you can control 5 to 7 neglected tropical diseases in a national program, and you can do it with subsidized and free drugs. Fabulous opportunity. We've been doing it in Rwanda and Burundi. We want to actually scale that up. We're inviting people to co-invest in that. But I know full well that the big picture of being able to touch 50 to 60 million people's lives with $100 million is going to be attractive as an opening conversation. But I've got to offer somebody, be it they are a corporate that are working in East Africa, a piece of saying, well, we would actually like to do that for Eastern Uganda. Or we would actually be interested in doing that for Equatorial Guinea, or we are interested, and they can actually, or a specific disease in a certain place. Lastly, the last two, we started to look at the whole issue of for-profit capital allocation. There's obviously a massive, and I think there's going to be more of this from the panel, there's going to be a lot of interest in social venture capital, impact investing. What I'm interested in doing is actually taking one of these very large granting funds, looking at where does the big issue that it strategically is going to hit, the geography it's going to actually focus on, and then see if we could get a social venture capital fund to invest in businesses that are going to hit exactly the same issue in exactly the same place. And then your capital allocation is agnostic in terms of what type, debt, equity, granting. You can use the best type of capital for the best type of job. I think you can actually make the most difference. And then we're running a pilot on rural health systems. We're looking at deliberately using it as a test bed to actually encourage commercial bottom billion businesses to invest at the same time as actually getting the single disease vertical campaigns to sort of work together. So it's that type of thinking that I see the future of private philanthropy exploring. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Elaine. Thank you. Okay. I wanted to start basically by, you may know who's in the room, but I don't. And I'd really like to know actually who we're talking to here. So could I ask those of you that work in development policy to put up your hands? Okay. I mean, you might have trouble figuring out who. Are there development practitioners in the room? Those of you that are out there actually doing stuff to help people, okay? All right. Now, can I ask those of you, okay, so who's the rest? Academics? Those of you who teach? Okay. Is there anybody else that isn't captured in those categories? Other. Students, oh yes, I'm sorry, I should have said those of you that aspire to be one of the above, right? Okay, that's good. It gives me a bit of a handle. Now, I'd like all of you that think that what you do or what you aspire to do will help change the lives of people for the better to stand up. All of you that think what you do and your organizations. Okay, yeah, but you can be brave about this one. Okay, now I would like, stay standing, please. All of you that know, that actually have evaluative evidence that you or your organizations make a difference in the lives of people, I'd like you to stay standing. And the rest of you, please sit down. This is where you can be humble about. Okay, no, that's, some decision-making going on there. Well, maybe, maybe not. Okay, no, this is good. This is good. Oh yeah, you can sit down now. You can sit down now. Okay, right. So there's enough of a sense in the room that some of you have tackled the question of knowing, and some of you haven't. And I guess when Adil asked me to, and it's really reflecting not just on my Rockefeller experience, but really on experience of the last 25 years of working in development and development evaluation, about what have I found that works in evaluating development? What have I learned, and what would I now be bringing to the table, bringing to the discussion on that? And I guess I wanted to sort of segue into a few key things to talk about that are somewhere on these slides, and Elaine will help me. Just one slide with a few keywords. But I wanted to segue into this with by thanking Adil and the Party Center for basically shaping and hosting these kinds of forums. I've been very impressed with the, I think this is exactly what universities should do. Invite people with multiple perspectives on the world, on problems, on issues, and what we do about it to talk together. And I think it's exactly what universities should do with bright young minds that are here, that clearly are the leaders of tomorrow, and with those of us that like to think we might have bright old minds, but to challenge the minds that have been in those roles, and those of you that are going to segue into those, because it's a range of perspectives, it's multiple perspectives that really matter in terms of the way we think about development, the way we frame it, the way we implement it, and the way we evaluate it. And unless we are actually able to embrace that as professionals, as students going out into the world, and those of us that have the fairly serious responsibility of actually framing how we evaluate this stuff, then I think we will have done development a disservice. We will have done the disciplines from which we come a disservice. But I also want to say that I think in some respects universities, at least when I was in university, I don't know if it's the same way now, does us a disservice. When I went to university, I was trained to be an expert. I was trained to know the answers. And I set out in the world thinking I knew something and thinking I could actually do something about this. I was rewarded for knowing the answers. I was rewarded for publishing. I was rewarded for being an expert. And little did I know that I would spend the next 25 years of my career in development unlearning the behavior that experts bring to this whole agenda. Not that I didn't know a few things that have proven to be useful, but it's the attitude of we're the expert and we know that I think has done, in many respects, development the biggest disservice of all. So that, combined with this kind of a gathering that has multiple perspectives, really, I think, sets the stage for some of the things I'd just like to highlight in terms of what I've learned. And I guess underpinning all of it, the unlearning to think you actually know what works for people is humility. And it's something that I think now, as for a whole lot of reasons, and I think what the first panel did, and I was sitting there listening to it, if we aren't now humble about how we can support institutions in economic growth and economic development, we bloody well better be humble. And what we take into the development field after what's happened in the last years of thinking we knew, if nothing else makes a point, I think that has. Now, those of you that have been in the development world, a lot longer know that the humility that comes from watching technical fixes that we all thought were going to produce healthier people and safer drinking water and all of those things that we all thought were going to happen and in many cases hasn't happened. I think the humility that comes with that needs to kind of wrap around the very good skills and expertise that we learn in institutions, but that we take to very complex development situations. And to Jonathan's point about philanthropy now playing a much larger role in development, I think that's true. And philanthropy in many respects is waking up to the challenge that it's not just about dispersing money to good people to do good things. That we now have to be partners in figuring this out. And I think it doesn't matter if you've got lots of money, if you're throwing money at things without not trying to figure it out carefully. More money isn't going to help. It may help in the short run, it's not going to help in the long run. And that also, I think, is something that not all of philanthropy has learned, but some philanthropy is starting to think about. That there just is not the money around to buy our way out of these problems. So if we can't buy our way out of it, and certainly the global economic architecture isn't going to help us do that. And if we can face up that philanthropy isn't going to help us buy our way out of problems, then we've got to really figure out how to do this well. Otherwise, the planet is in peril, as people have warned us now for quite some time. There are things in development that work, and there are things that evaluators have done to help bring those to the surface. The power dynamics don't make it all that easy to then put what works into practice. And I think some of the speakers in the previous panel made that point very, very well. The figuring out what we mean by development. So we've got multiple perspectives matter, the humility that we go into this. What's the development paradigm that we are all subscribing to, and how do we make that clear? And it may sound like a very, very simple thing, but it's not. All of the organizations that I've worked for, United Nations, large international NGOs, small international NGOs, governments, Aboriginal organizations, all have trouble really defining their development paradigm. Either not because they don't know it, it's deeply, deeply embedded in the kind of institution, in the institution's charter in some instances. If you're a financial institution, you have a way of thinking about what development is. If you're a rights-based institution, you have a way of thinking about what matters. But in almost all of them, it's not explicit enough to help those of us that actually have to shape work and then evaluate it, do that adequately, do that in a way that really informs how organizations need to go forward. And Jonathan, to your point, the Rockefeller Foundation is now reaching its 100th anniversary. It has changed its program dramatically from being deeply into sector-specific work to being at the intersection between sectors. So no longer deeply into public health. Now the foundation is looking at the challenge of health systems, where all of the pieces in health need to come together if we're actually going to have viable institutions and systems that meet the needs. So it's no longer adequate to just do one or two of those pillars. Now what we need to look at is how the complexity of that globalization has brought to the world, how the complexity of systems can actually work better. So it's been a brave new change for this foundation, and we're still trying to find our legs in terms of defining what the work is, defining the development paradigm around which we will evaluate it, and then bringing appropriate methods to actually evaluate systems change, to actually evaluate things that where often evaluation tools aren't that adequate. So we're in somewhat of that transition. We're trying to now, along with many others, face up to this. Okay, defining development. What is the paradigm that we subscribe to? Whose voice counts? What matters? And we all know the famous cliche of measure what matters. So who gets to say what matters? And I think that's where organizations really all start to kind of lose the plot because of the power dynamics of who gets a say. When you look at progressive development evaluation, it surfaces findings around a number of different dimensions. It takes the multiple perspectives seriously, it takes voice seriously, and it brings to the surface the needs of beneficiaries, the needs of those that are actually implementing the work, and then it puts those together to say, what do we actually do? How do we define the problem through the eyes of people who we actually do care about? How do they have a voice in evaluating what works? And then the governance of what do we then do about that? That's not a terribly easy equation when you're in institutions that have a charter, have a mission, have a mandate, have a strategy, have a board of governors that has a view on the way things go. I think, in fact, that's actually probably, if I had now to look back and say, what's the most difficult part of making that happen? It's wrapping that all together in the governance model of making that real. Some organizations manage to do it quite well. Others manage to do it in a very token kind of way. And I think going forward, we are not going to get this right if we continue to do it in a very token kind of way. A few other things that I'd just like to highlight in terms of examples I've seen in development evaluation of approaches that really surface things that then are actually real and that can be actionable. Context matters. Doug spoke very nicely to the scale and sustainability issue. We are all about, all of our organizations, replication, scale, taking something that may appear to work in a very fragile kind of way, taking it out then to every region and every village and every whatever. The pressure, and all of it for usually very good intentions, sometimes not good intentions, but usually because of the urgency of the problem. Skipping the step of then testing what works in what context, under what conditions, and for who, for men, for women. How many of our organizations, those of you that were left standing in the room, can you honestly say, hand on heart, that you do that well? I don't think I know. Certainly I have not been in a situation in organizations that do that part well. I've been in organizations that can do the first part well, really looking at what works in a place for people, really collecting genuinely gender disaggregated data, really caring about marginalized peoples and looking at what happens to them. I have not been in institutions that have very well then managed to take that to a scale that actually is starting to make an enormous difference. And I think some of the constraints of doing it is the time frame under which both our own organizations operate, whatever our strategic planning frameworks are, whatever our disbursement levels are, or time frames are. That all drives us to a speed and to want to do things probably more quickly than is good. And I think we need to look at that. Capacity and time frame. Okay, I'm just wrap up on these last few points. Capacity and time frame. I have seen over and over again in the hundreds and hundreds of evaluations I've been involved with that capacity is consistently underestimated in terms of the need for it to sustain good institutions, to build the skills, capacity, and the empowerment needed to have a place at the table, to have voice. That's a capacity issue. It's not an issue of just invite them and they're there. No, it's a capacity issue that over time, how do you give people a feeling of dignity and agency and voice to be at the table and actually really, if you believe in multiple perspectives, then we've all got a ways to go in terms of the capacity that's needed to have those multiple voices at the table. And all of our organizations underestimate how long that's going to take, underestimate the kinds of skills that are needed to actually get there. And accountability has been raised in a few other contexts. And the piece that I think is missing is the downward accountability, is our ability. Someone was concerned about NGO accountability. I think that's right. And certainly every NGO I've worked for, I think, strove in many cases, but needed to have stronger accountability. But accountability to the people that were actually really trying to make a difference in their lives. And there are some efforts now to look at that kind of double loop. Most of the accountability in our organizations is upwards, despite whether we would like to think that it's downwards. I'll finish there, but these are some of the key things that I think, in terms of an approach to development, approach to the way we think about evaluation, that we absolutely have to get right if we're actually going to, together, philanthropy, private, public sector, if we're actually going to do this right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. I have good-looking slides, but my assistant told me that we are not supposed to bring slides, so I didn't bring them. So I'll get by with my own good looks. Before I start, let me introduce myself. I direct a center at MIT, and a very generous donor who also backed Doug's organization gave $50 million to the center, and we give scholarships to MIT students who are generally entrepreneurial to create innovations so they can establish for-profit innovative enterprises in poor countries. Now, how did I get here? And by the way, this year we have 35 such fellows whom we give scholarships, and they are developing various ideas and plans to create these enterprises. Now, let me tell you how I got there. First of all, I came to America. I grew up in Bangladesh. I came to America 35 years ago to go to college. And the first thing I noticed as I was preparing for college, that not all good schools were in Washington, D.C. This was a little surprising because in Bangladesh, most important resources, best universities, whatever we have, are concentrated in Dhaka. And so that made me think from there on that is there a connection between concentration of resources and stagnation and dispersion of resources or facilities and progress? And over time, I'm increasingly convinced that that is indeed the case. And of course, for geopolitical reasons, Cold War and all sorts of things, the world has been perhaps forced to give aid to poor countries, to manage geopolitically, but at the end of the day, it concentrated resources in poor countries. And so that's why I realized that the resources that are concentrated in Dhaka actually reflect the distribution of power. And the power, of course, in pre-colonial or colonial time, and subsequently through the aid regime we have worldwide have only contributed to concentrating resources in poor countries' capitals in particular. But what is really necessary is dispersion of resources. And that has been the progress, whatever progress has been made. So take, for example, accountability and other things we're talking about. If you look at the history of England, for instance, where the cradle of modern democracy or capitalism, the accountability came out not because the king had money, but because he had a shortage of money. Because he had a shortage of money, he was compelled to go to citizens or whoever other important people and collect taxes. But there was no democracy, so they said, you cannot just come take our money. Because by this time, by the way, due to the weaknesses of the monarch, the property rights have emerged. And so if you take our money, then that's a violation of property rights. So then, of course, he called a little group, and this is about 1260s or so, which he called parliament, means discussion. And if that group approved a new tax idea the king had, then the king could supposedly tax people. And so every 10 years, 20 years, the parliament like this met, which is just like this, a workshop. And basically, a new custom emerged that the parliament has to approve whenever the king has an idea of taxation. And so every time the king came for some tax, because the costs are going up, it costs money to hire soldiers or bureaucrats or whatever. And then the parliament realized that it has some power. So every time the king came for something, they stripped a little bit of power from the king. They said, okay, we'll agree to your tax if you agree to that, if you free that port, if you do this or that. So over time, the king lost all his power. His power was stripped away, and the parliament rose in power. And that's how, again, there are many, many examples. How concentration of power was diffused, how the monarchs or anyone who had power had to get down from his high horses and serve the people, is a story of dispersion of power. And so if we had, let's assume, 500 years ago, a situation whereby, let's say the mankind was advanced enough and created the World Bank and other aid regime in the world and said, if England is poor at this time, it needs money, give the King of England some money. Then the compromises that gave rise to democracy and development would not have taken place. And the accountability would not have come about. The story of Western progress is the story of dispersion of power. And I saw this is one important point. The second point is I started working in New York, and I realized the most taxi drivers, at least many of them, come from my little Bangladesh. So and then I increasingly started to understand people are migrating out of their countries and going to other countries because they smell a little bit of economic opportunity. I myself was an immigrant. And so it's not that we have to rescue poor people. They are seeking breaks themselves. There are millions of illegal aliens that we worry about in this country because they're crossing the border, going through extreme difficulties, and somehow seeking a break. So if a break comes about, either through technological power, technological distribution, or then they grab it. Or sometimes, even if they don't get that break, they break away themselves and go to places where they might find a new opportunity. So we don't have to rescue them. We just need to give them a break. And then I also realized the computing technology. In the college I went, I was a token representative of a group that approved the first buying of a computer in the 80s. There was a $3 million computer that had so much power, etc. We met some 10 times to make this decision. And eventually I realized in the late 80s, personal computers have the same amount of power as we were doing lots of research and deciding for a $3 million computer. And so I noticed that the Moore's law, which is a tremendous dispersive force. Every 18 months or so, computing power goes down in price by about half. So every 3 years, it goes to 1/4. So every 6 years, it goes to 1/16. Every 12 years, 1/256. So every 15 years, $1,000 worth of microchips become $1. And I realized that this is a tremendous dispersive force. Of course, so I thought, maybe we could distribute computers and people become have more power. And the point is, in poor countries, you cannot have, people cannot read or write, so computers are not that useful. But remember, at the same time, the historical progress I talked about in England or elsewhere in Europe were mostly based on tools, very initial level. Let's say eyeglass, somebody could be a carpenter, and by the time he became a relatively good carpenter, he lost his eyesight. But an eyeglass made a huge difference. So instead of losing his eyesight for the next few years when he just became competent, he suddenly became more productive. So similarly, other tools, be it computer or something else, could empower people. They could then have their purchasing power and buy other things and unleash their economies. So I realized that's a computer could do because its costs are going down. But again, because the people need literacy, they can't quite use it. So one day I was working in a little firm, and we had our computers were connected by rudimentary networking technology. And we became more productive. We didn't have to exchange floppy disks. I mean, I don't know, many of you may not remember floppy disks anymore. But there used to be such a thing. And so that was more cumbersome. And one time, my network broke down, and I was waiting for someone to come and fix it. And that reminded me, and so I was wasting time just thinking about this. It reminded me of a day in 1971 when I was 13 years old. Bangladesh was going through a civil war with basically, the East Pakistan, West Pakistan were splitting. And my family had moved to a remote rural area. And there was no other infrastructure there. And in fact, that's one way we were safe, because the army, Pakistani army, couldn't come over there easily. So one time my mother asked me to get some medicine for a younger sibling, and I walked 10 kilometers all morning, and when I got there, the medicine man wasn't there. So I came back walking all afternoon. And I realized that connectivity is productivity. So just like comparing my own situation in New York vis-a-vis the village situation in 21 years earlier, I realized that connectivity is productivity, whether it's in a modern office or an underdeveloped village. And people can talk, so they don't have to be literate. And I also realized that cell phones are also being empowered by microchips, so they would follow the same price situation has been happening with computers. So on the demand side, connectivity is productivity. People will become productive. They can then purchase the services because they have additional income. On the supply side, the prices are falling. So therefore, one way or another, this should work out. I went to all sorts of experts, and they said, no, you ought to have purchasing power. This is very poor situation, okay? And I said, why do I have to worry about purchasing power? Because if people are going to get productive, they're going to pay for it, okay? So anyway, many myths I faced like this, and I eventually realized that one way to do it, because if I go to Dhaka, then that's where all the infrastructure is. But then it's not that interesting, because the economics will tell me that it can be spread. So therefore, I had to find how can I actually go to rural areas. And because there was no other infrastructure, it's very hard to bring about a new service. Like internet was booming in this country because people already had computers, they had software, hardware, modem. Again, many of you may not know modem, but it used to exist. But the point is, then I started looking at these microcredit organizations. And that's how I went to Grameen Bank, because it had 1,000 branches, okay? And they had borrowers, like 2 million borrowers at the time. Right now has about 5 million. And I started talking to them that perhaps they can be a client so that it will help me distribute the service in throughout the country. And they were not that interested, so I simply focused on what is it that they really do. Typically, they give loans for chicken, ducks, cow. The cow gives milk, and somebody can pay off the loan over a year. So I basically said, a cell phone can be a cow, because somebody could take a phone, and then it could be, she could sell the service in her neighborhood and pay off the loan. So I went to Professor Yunus, and I said, look, I think the cell phone can be a cow. And then they said, this is a little crazy, but kind of interesting. But if you think it can be done, so make it happen. So basically, I convinced them, one American in New York, his name is Joshua Mailman. He gave me $100,000. I created a company called Gonophone, means phones for the masses, okay? And then I basically went around the world. Many telephone companies rejected me because they said, not only I have a bad idea because I'm thinking about a poor country, but also poor of the poor country, rural people, etc. But anyway, I flew at least 1 million miles, many sleepless nights, some minor loss of hair, but I managed to create a consortium, okay, that involved Grameen Bank and the Norwegian telephone company, etc. And we created what is now known as Grameen Phone. And at least right now, the company has 30 million subscribers. The cell phone revolution has come about all over the world, but I was only preparing for Bangladesh. And there are many other companies. So Bangladesh has now about 60 million phones, which is a more than 100 times rise from what used to be when I went there, that had about 500,000 phones in 1993. And so this situation I think, has made people more productive. And what I want to say is that according to certain statistics, the GDP of the country is at least 2 percentage points has been pushed up by the cell phones. But let's assume it's only 1%, okay? So if it's 1%, over a 10-year period, cumulative effect is more than 10%. So what I would like to say is all these numbers we're talking, what Nancy says, this is impossible to throw, to send that much money and this and that. Let me make the point that we are talking about 2 billion people. 1 billion apparently has $1 a day economy. Another billion has $2 a day economy. So you'll see it's 365 plus 365 plus 365. It's at least $1 trillion economy of the 2 billion people. If you make them productive by 10%, you have $100 billion. And by the way, this is dispersed. This is among all the people. Therefore, they cannot be abused. And also, you have 2 billion brains activated to think how to use that money. The real problem comes from our own thinking, that we can tell what to be done. The real problem is that all those brains are getting wasted. That is a massive resource that should be unleashed through productivity tools. And that can be done. The cell phone has, among other things, proven that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. 3 fascinating different stories about investment that works using different approaches. Let's open it up to the floor for comments or questions. We'll start right here in the front.
Thank you, especially for the last one, interesting. I'm Ranza Kutman, Boston University Humphrey Fellowship Program. First question will be about the dispersion of power in the development. Do you think that a way to overcome state failure is to give the individual the economic freedom to rise by itself? And also about the sustainability of philanthropy. I know it does make sense, but that's the question. Do you think that there's a shift between those people who are giving money from the G7 or G7 to people or organization from China or India giving money to do some philanthropy? And also the second question is, do you think that social venture capital is the next step for the philanthropy to be sustainable in the future? Thank you.
Let's take 2 more questions, and then I'll let the panel respond. In the back.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about donors and politics, or to extend the category a bit, business people and politics. And I'm Jeff Rubin from the History Department at Boston University. And my thinking is that historically in the developing world, high net worth individuals and organizations have quite often vetoed policies geared toward progressive social reform or alternative economic policies, often in quite violent and dramatic ways. So I'm wondering if there's any carryover. Does participation of ultra net worth individuals as donors foster broader private sector openness over time to progressive kinds of policies regarding national or international economies or environmental policies or the inclusions of people as citizens in social programs? And to carry the question a bit further, has there been any thought about measuring that? Thank you.
Interesting question. I saw another one in the way back. It's Dilip. My eyes aren't that good. I need those eyeglasses you were promising to improve my productivity.
Just to be somewhat provocative, the 2 questions I'm going to raise about private philanthropy. One is the evaluation of the activities that are funded by the philanthropies. To what extent are they really measuring the impact on the lives of the intended beneficiaries, as against, the intent of the donor? The first speaker's, the first priority was the intent and the fun of the donor. You look at microfinance organizations, or you look at cell phones, 2 examples that were discussed. At least the careful attempts to measure the impact on the lives of beneficiaries. I've done one on cell phones in West Bengal. I know Marcel Fafchamp's work in Maharashtra. Find no effect. Microfinance, Abhijit Banerjee is going to be here this afternoon. Looked at the effect, very carefully controlled study in Hyderabad, no effect. Dean Carlin has been studying effects in Indonesia, Philippines, no effect. So the two issues that arise in my mind, to what extent are the criteria that are used by nonprofit organizations really focused on what they should be? And I often see, there's perhaps a lack of technical capacity, but to a large extent in my interaction with NGOs, I find a reluctance to really engage in serious evaluation, partly because then you're asking people to evaluate themselves. And the second problem is a proliferation of programs, a proliferation of nonprofit organizations, very little coordination across them. And quite often see many villages with so many microfinance organizations. It's just, these guys are borrowing from one to repay the other. So, and the question, therefore, is, these are partly sort of governance issues, where it's partly intent, abstracting from sort of the governance issues within the organizations. It's a larger one.
Let's start with those 3, and I'm going to turn to Iqbal to take the first one, which was on dispersion of power. And then we'll come to
what is the exact question?
As I understood it, is with the dispersion of power sort of minimize state control over development dynamic. Is that a fair summary of your question? Okay.
See, I gave good example history. Again, we have very little time here, but I don't see why should the government run development? Government is supposed to maintain law and order, okay? And so this thinking that the government would give rise to development, I think is frankly fundamentally flawed, okay? It's citizens development has to be of the people, by the people, for the people. And so that is what I mean by dispersion of power, that it goes to the people, okay? Now, so the government, if statist plans have never worked throughout the world, Okay, so it historically it has not worked. It defies many serious economists' work. I can go on for hours. So I don't know what you're talking about, to be honest. Okay, but what I'm saying is, but you also, I remember you said state failure or something. If you concentrate power, then you actually make the country brittle, and that is what gives rise to state failures. I mean, honestly, Pakistan hopefully is not a state failure, but what I'm saying is if you look at these countries where there was a concentration of power, either through aid or through mineral wealth, that's the kind of things have given rise to problems. So I don't think the actual dispersion that I produce these, I grow fish, you grow rice, and we exchange and we connect. That makes the societies more cohesive. Okay, the Adam Smith have said long time ago that you specialize and exchange. That makes people cohesive. Hayek have said long time ago that lot of dispersed information has to be taken into account to advance countries. So not only historically it is wrong, it defies the thinking of many serious economists to concentrate power. Power corrupts. We know this.
Thank you, Iqbal. The second set of questions were really about the role of philanthropy, the role of business people within it. How do you measure impact? What are you measuring? And I'm going to open it up to all three panelists. And maybe, Nancy, do you want to go first? And then we'll let Doug, or you want Doug to go first?
I'm happy to
Go.
have a shot at it. And maybe I'll address sort of one subset of it that speaks to probably more to Mark's question. I think if we take a step back and look at what actually gets evaluated, who sets the evaluation agenda? Most evaluation is funded by donors, funded by philanthropy, funded by those who have the money. We really need to take a very hard look at what drives evaluation and then be realistic within that. Of course, donors are going to want evaluation to speak to what they hope to get out of it. But unless we start to address the asymmetries of what gets evaluated and who's actually evaluating, we're not going to get we maybe need to be more realistic that we're not going to get the kind of criteria and voice in those conversations until we address the asymmetry of all of that. I'll give you another example. Very little evaluation work looks at policy coherence. Because policies of countries, policies of multilateral institutions, policies of probably philanthropy are in some cases contradictory. You know, we may have arms of our institutions that are doing things that aren't particularly coherent in terms of improving the lives of people. And certainly if one would try to get evaluations of the policy coherence of all of our organizations that support, drive development in whatever way, I think it would be a sobering look. Some organizations have tried to do that, but that's where the lens, until we actually start to look at an evaluation of the impact of policies of rich countries on poor countries, how much evaluation is done of that? Very little at all. Maybe a little bit if you look at evaluation of fisheries policy in West Africa. It's quite shocking. You start to see the impact of European policies on fisheries on West Africa. And immediately you see, well, it shouldn't be like that. But those are the kinds of things that aren't actually going to be driven. So we're not going to get criteria, we're not going to get approaches until we start having more voices determine the agenda and more voices actually involved in the evaluation.
I think I also heard a sort of sub-question, which is basically getting business people that might be seen to have an agenda involved in philanthropy basically a good thing, or is that a dangerous thing? And I have a sort of couple of perspectives, having sort of been in that space for the last sort of 5 years or so. First of all, I think you have to recognize that for most people, as they inherit wealth or choose to use wealth that they have created over the last sort of 10, 15 years, what they're on is a very steep learning curve. I mean, if we think this is complicated and we spent 20, 25 years trying to figure out how to actually achieve social change, you think about somebody who essentially is just trying to understand that whole scene. And just even to understand the whole of the complexity of the stakeholders is a major task for what are often very bright, intuitively very aggressive, and somebody that wants to actually make a big impact and wants to be as successful as they have been in their business career as they want to actually be in their philanthropic career. So one of the issues is that I actually find that as long as one actually approaches, and I'll come back to Nancy's word, approaches donors with some humility, which actually I often see that we don't in the charitable world, then we can have a very useful conversation about sharing our perspectives of what is success. I typically find that business people are quite open to the idea of trying to think through the issues of what is the measures of success for social impact. And they're often very willing to engage in opening their minds up in terms of different ways of actually thinking about it than the typical breadth and intensity of impact that we typically go around looking for in terms of sort of numbers of impact proxies or activity indicators or whatever to get to long-term impact. Increasingly, is that a bad thing, having business people that will have a certain type of agenda involved in terms of the potentially, especially if they've got large amount of wealth and using a large amount of philanthropy involved in a developing country? Well, of course it can be. I mean, it kind of like depends. And I think what is partly up to us is if we're willing to journey with these people. I mean, we've been working with a particular client for the last 10 years, and I've seen them become a very, very sophisticated donor who really understands now the importance of evaluation, the importance of spending money on independent evaluation, the importance of bringing analytical and academic partners involved in terms of really good baselines and everything else. But they started off thinking about single year, single project projects anywhere in the world that had children in them, and that was where they started. If we don't want to actually play and we don't want to actually work with them on that journey and just turn around and say, well, no, you're not sophisticated enough, we don't actually trust you to actually work with us, then we lose a massive opportunity, because we all know that a lot of the public funds to actually keep an awful lot of philanthropy going are actually declining at the same time that there is new private capital available. But it needs to be private capital that needs to be engaged with, and you need to have with some humility in order to actually do that.
Let's take 3 more comments or questions. I think you had your hand up. Yeah.
My name is Alvin Sengeng, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the UMass Boston in public policy. I'm relatively new to the field of international development, but having lived and having been raised in Cameroon, because that's where I'm from, I'm definitely very familiar with the issues, and I'm actually part of a small nonprofit in Boston that's basically led by young Africans and looking at development issues back home. And I'm just curious to find out opinions about the role of youth in development issues, because from what I know so far, it hasn't really been discussed that much. So I'm just interested in finding out opinions about what role youth can play, especially youth that are in the diasporas in So, yeah.
Thank you. Let's take the one in the middle in the back, and then we'll come back to the front.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Tim Wise. I'm at the Global Development Environment Institute at Tufts University. As someone, I find this very interesting as someone who comes out of a background in grassroots development and then moved after 10 years in that into policy research. I'd like to ask a question about policy research and about research and strategic research, that is, the evaluation of research, because in part I moved out of grassroots development because I saw the initiatives of community-based groups, very inspiring efforts, undone by global policies. And so the importance of policy change, I think, is critical. The role of research in trying to get beyond what Paul Krugman is fond of calling zombie ideas that have been driving policy, have been proven wrong. So it's not enough to prove that they're wrong. It's how do we, so we've done a lot of thinking at the Global Development Environment Institute about, so how do you do the research that not only demonstrates something, but actually gets it into the hands of the people who need it and the people who are going to move change. And for example, our research over the last 10 years on globalization issues has been largely, I think we came to conclude that it was change was going to happen from developing countries, not within the United States first, and I think that's been proven true. And so we made a lot of effort to do collaborative projects to get it in the hands of people who in developing countries who could influence their governments, who could change the policy pressures that they would put on. So I guess my question is sort of, you know, I guess Professor Simon introduced this, that we started at 40,000 feet and then went down to a hovering helicopter. I mean, I guess my question is, how do you put the research agenda in the service of policy that lands everybody on the ground? Enabling that micro change to actually take hold and go somewhere.
Thank you. Right up here.
Well, my name is Hasnath. My name is Hasnath, and incidentally or accidentally, I speak the same language what Professor Iqbal Qadir and Professor Dilip Mukherjee speak. That means we have all came from Bengal or Bangladesh. Well, my specific question or comment, whatever you say, that is about Professor Iqbal Qadir. And about two things. A, his comment that everything is concentrated in Dhaka, while not everything is concentrated in Washington, D.C. And his second comment that government virtually does not have any role or should not have any role in development. Both these comments are theoretically challenging, politically sensitive, and practically impossible. And it is also very much disturbing to me. A, because the first comment, the concentration versus dispersal, it's a huge debate, integration versus disintegration, because there is a concept of economies of scale, there is a concept of agglomeration economy. The whole Paul Krugman's Nobel Prize is based on concentration and agglomeration economy and all these things. So there is no concrete conclusion. Nobody can take it, including Professor Iqbal Qadir. And second one, I'm a little bit astonished to hear from the professor of development of MIT. I must be careful about making any comment, right? And that government does not...
Don't hold back, sir.
Yeah, I mean, government does not have any role. And I think he's talking about before Second World War. Then whole development economics does not exist if there is no role in government, right? I mean, if government does not have any role, then the whole concept of externality and the environment does not come into picture. And for that matter, we should not waste our dinner and lunch in this room. I mean, let's go to Wall Street Journal and everything should be done by Wall Street and the market. Then the whole concept of market failure does not appear. What I said. So I think
we'll
he should clarify that.
May I respond?
Do you have a third point, or are you finished?
I mean, the whole concept...
No, because we have about 10 more minutes. What I'd like to do is provide an opportunity for the panel to respond. And then, Adil, I did see your hand. I'm going to follow Kevin's thing and let you have the last word after we respond. And given
Can I just quickly say something? I taught at a school of government. I very much believe in government, but we need to save our governments from getting into wrong roles. That's why I'm saying it should not have role in managing economic assets. It should not be in that role. That's what I'm saying. Government has tremendously important role in the overall development of a country. And that's precisely why we need to save the health of the government. And if you bring the government, if you drag it into the economic management of the country, then not only you hold the country back, you hold the government back. That's my real point. I'm also struggling with the limitation of time. I'll be more than happy to discuss with you in any language, in Bengali or in English. The point is, the government, we need to save the government. If we want to have we should have good government. The health of the government is extremely critical for economic development. And that's precisely why we should not drag it into all these roles.
Let's go to the two other points. One was the role of youth, particularly youth from the diaspora, in the development dynamic, and then Tim's question about how do you get research to land the helicopter.
All right. I'd love to respond to those. The youth question is absolutely spot on. It is at our peril that we continue without strong dimensions on youth. I mean, you are the leaders of tomorrow. You are the leaders of today, actually. Clearly, there have to be different ways of doing this, and most organizations don't have ways of formalizing the involvement of youth, and we should. We really should. I was sorry when I joined the foundation that I missed the days of Rockefeller's support for a program called LEAD, which was a leadership in environment and development, which they supported, chose leaders from youth leaders from different countries, and invested in those leaders of exposing them to broad perspectives and different experiences. I think looking at some of the evaluations as they came into the foundation, it was one of the most powerful programs around. And I think there are other examples of lots of our organizations do this, but we should be doing more of it. I completely agree. The research question, if I may, I think that is actually one of the fundamental problems of why we are failing to be informed as we reinvent the wheel. And I've struggled myself with the lack of connection between research and evaluation. Research, evaluation, and policy aren't as stitched together as they should be. I think some of the reasons have to do with the expert culture of research. When researchers try and talk to either the public or development practitioners, often it's lost in translation. How you operationalize research isn't an easy one-step dance. And some of my colleagues in the evaluation world from IDRC, the International Development Research Center, have been starting to look at this in a very serious way. The agricultural sector, I think, has really suffered from its agricultural research institutions not being able to translate research into good agricultural development practices, despite very, very good research. So there's a lot of work to be done there. I think time frame, the expert culture, we need to address those.
Two quick comments on the role of youth. Yeah, really endorse what Nancy's actually said. Partly for very pragmatic reasons. That in a lot of developing countries, they're a very high proportion of the population anyway. We only have to look at North Africa to see what the power of young people can actually bring. The energy, often from the perspective of community organizations, they're often the voluntary group that can actually do most. It re-emphasizes the whole issue of education and why education is important. And one of the points I wanted to bring is they're really the hope for the paradigm shift in the cultures and the way in which a culture actually thinks about the possibility of development and change that the older generation actually can't actually help with. So they're often the hope for the paradigm shift that you actually need within a culture in order to actually embrace good development. So for all reasons, youth is really important. I'd like to echo the sort of missing gap realization between that sort of 40,000 feet and some good policy research going on at about 5,000 feet. Definitely, there is no point doing fabulous on-the-ground, community, grassroots type development if the whole thing actually then gets wiped away by the fact of a global policy coming down with unintended consequences. So really important and endorse that point.
If I could make one comment on that as we try to close this session, I think we're in a university and we have many academics here, and until such time as we begin to value applied questions that are policy and program relevant and reward our junior scientists coming up our academic ladders and create career tracks for doing that, then we will constantly be in a situation where the power and the intellectual ability of universities underserve the development dynamic. And I think the university needs to do the university as an academic, as an entity, needs to think very carefully about what does it reward and what message is it sending to its youth and its junior faculty. And this is a particular sore point for me, having spent 16 years at another institution which couldn't figure out how it wanted to deal with applied research, and having found at Boston University a professional school, not an academic department, which actually can embed those kind of questions within its career ladder and structure, is frankly fundamentally why I'm at Boston University rather than at another institution. So that's I'm trying to figure out how to land that helicopter with the Center for Global Health and Development specifically. What I'd like to do before we end, and Adil, I'm going to take you off the stage for a second, but I'm going to put the Pardee Center on the stage, because the Pardee Center is about creating venue and fora for this kind of conversation. But actually, Rockefeller has a very similar sort of opportunity and structure, and Nancy had asked for a moment or two to sort of say something about the Bellagio Center, who also seeks to create opportunities for conversations of importance.
And thank you, Jonathan. And this is a shameless advertisement for one of the wonderful things that the foundation has, which is the Bellagio Center. And it arrived through an endowment, a very special endowment. It's a center in Italy that is focused on providing residencies for scholars, for practitioners, for people that are interested, that need a space to work further on global issues, local issues. So there's a residency program, and then there's a program of facilitated conferences. And there's an application process that's on our website. I've got some brochures here. And please, those of you where this would help you to further your thinking, your debates, your analysis, either as an individual resident or for programs, please apply and help us take advantage of this amazing center. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to comment to Kevin that I think I got it in on time. The challenge was met. I'd like to particularly thank the panelists for what I think was a thought-provoking, I certainly have some notes to ponder, session, and I want to thank the audience for a stimulating discussion upon completion of the panel. Thank you very much.